welcome everybody. We got a sold out crowd. I know a lot of you dealt with parking and challenges getting here, so we appreciate it. We're going to record this, and so you're going to be able to pick this up, online afterwards, along with the data. And I think it's going to be a great event. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do it a little bit differently. So I had lunch with Karen Burgess probably 3 or 4 months ago, and we started talking about state of the industry. How do we do this different? It's one of the marquee events that we do. And there's just so much that's impacting commercial real estate right now. Right? There's a lot of questions, and so we want to address them. Some of those questions we're going to address today include what in the world is going on with the office sector? Is it going to get better? Is it obsolete? Where are we heading? Is America ever going to come back to work? They're working overseas. They're not working here yet. Is that trend going to follow and come back to the States? How do you even underwrite assets today? Assets are all over the map, right? So it's a very difficult process. And why do we keep using this word obsolete more and more and more in these different asset classes? So there's distress, and we're going to talk about the distress that's out there. Some of it is current, but there's a lot that's pending. And then we're also going to talk about where San Diego fits into the spectrum. Is San Diego faring better than the rest of the country? So when I moderate these panels, what I try to do is just make them as informative as possible. And so when you do those, you need to have the right people. And so Karen and I thought, how do we get the right people? And so Karen and I said, let's go to the street. Let's find the right people to advise us in this process. And so in front of you, we have 4 male models that we have found on the street, of varying vintage and expertise. But seriously, we all know who these men are, and they don't need an introduction. Although I'll give them an introduction because we know male models love the attention. And we also know that they've been making more money than any of us in the room, probably the past 12 months as well. So I appreciate everybody showing up. Here's what we're going to do. Each panelist is going to have 15 to 20 minutes, and they're going to have slides. And the panelists are going to be able to ask questions, but the idea is to kind of work through it. I'll ask some questions as well. We're going to start with David Marino, who is the tenant advocate. And everybody knows who Dave is, right? And when we thought about doing this in all seriousness, I drove down and met Dave for breakfast and said, hey, I really like to get you back on stage. It's been a little while. He's so articulate, understands the business. Probably hasn't been a tenant rep broker that's dominated like Dave has over his career. And so this is his 4th downturn. Is that right? 4th downturn. So just, in a position to really provide some great perspective. And so I'm going to kick it off with Dave and ask him to walk us through our thoughts, or his thoughts in the market.
Great, thanks, Chad. So I figured I'd start with a little survey. I'd like to see an honest show of hands of all of you in the room that go in the office a day or month or less. Raise your hand if you fit in that category. Okay. Show of hands of everybody going in the office 5 days a week, full time. Look at that. Wow. It's like 80%, maybe more. Okay, how many 2 to 3 days a week on what we call hybrid schedule? Okay, great, like maybe 15%. So yeah, congratulations, right? We're the only industry doing this.
There's a lot of bosses.
That's true. That's where all the money's being made, right here in this room. The folks that aren't here, they're not, they're the half day a month kind of folks. So let me give you just a little background, because I don't think most of you actually know me. So I moved to San Diego in '89 after finishing my MBA at USC. Previously, I got an undergrad degree in economics. And so I really like numbers. I like graphs. I like trends. I like to think about this stuff. I'm a little obsessed by it. And I was a total nerd in high school. I was the guy that graduated with a high 3 and was yearbook editor. Didn't play a sport, unlike this monster next to me. And so I'm really just a simple guy. My parents were both school teachers, public school teachers, and from Yucaipa, California, out in the Inland Empire, and kind of moved down here knowing nobody and really not knowing a lot. And so just started figuring it out with Trammell Crow Company for 2 years, and that blew apart in the early 90s when the real estate industry took the first of the 4 corrections that I've now lived through. And in 1991, started working with a tenant rep firm out of LA called Langdon Ryder, which was sold to CB. That acquisition went very poorly, and resigned 6 months later to join Jason Hughes at what was Irving Hughes. And then 12 years ago, we started this. We just opened our 11th office in Salt Lake City. We have just over 200 people now, and things are great. But things are great because they leave me alone. Nobody reports to me. I don't do any of the administrative work for the company. I'm exclusively client-facing, so that's all I do. So like all of you in the room, I do deals. I do transactions. And I do lab, office, and industrial, and consider myself sort of a student of this. I really like it intellectually. I really like to analyze it, understand it, look for trends. And the first trend I saw when March 15th approximately happened, 2020, we all went home, right? I mean, every office building emptied out in a week. And what was remarkable to me, very quickly, enabled by the internet and video technology, was that everybody was pretty effective quickly. And people were liking it. I was talking to CEOs and CFOs and business owners, and they were liking it too, which is what scared me, right? The market was telling me, number one, it was working, and secondly, the employer was also enjoying the experience. And I've said, had this happened in 1980, when we didn't have the internet and didn't have these technologies, right, we'd all be back a long time ago, okay? But now, here we are, 4+ years post-COVID, and behavior is set. And we use the word cycle, and I think describing what's happening right now is not a cycle at all. The early 90s was a cycle when the market was overbuilt and the banking industry got taken over by the federal government, and there was a full collapse in commercial real estate, and the assets devalued. Those of you who weren't here, by the way, look at someone who's bald like Andy Liddell or has gray hair like Casey Brown. Okay, those are the ones of us who lived through this, okay, in the early 90s. Virtually every office building in UTC and downtown was foreclosed upon or had the equity wiped out by the partner in the deal. Like, I think every one but one downtown, and pretty much all of them in UTC, between 1991 and 1995. Like, we lived through that. That happened, right? And then you had the tech wreck, which is a cycle. It lasted a couple of years. The mortgage crisis, which lasted a couple of years. And now we have this new thing that is this kind of unicorn event where there's been a new bargain struck between the employer and the employer and the employee. And that is, we're going to embrace this new way of working. Over half the companies that I work with don't have a hybrid policy at all. Like you ask the CFO, CEO, business owner, like, what's your remote work policy? And they say, well, we don't really have one. The people show up when they want, and they're working from home, and sometimes they're working here, and we have a policy of work where you thrive. I'm like, well, what's that? They say, well, it's just people do what they want. Okay. Or we have something, MyTech and other clients of mine, they have something called remote first. They literally have a policy. They want people to work remotely first, or that they'll hire somebody anywhere in the world for a job opening. Anywhere in the world today. Okay, it's a global company. And this is how people are behaving. Okay, and so there has been this really shift where most, okay, and you got to be careful of looking at anecdotes, right? There's always an example that can prove anything in a vacuum. Okay, but you can't look at outliers. You can't look at things that are 3 deviations one direction or the other. You have to look at what's going on in the mass market. And what's going on in the mass market is the people aren't coming back. And they're not coming back full time for the most part like we all are. And so I think about like Marsh Insurance, for example, in UTC as a classic example. 550 employees out of their San Diego office, 100,000 square feet of space pre-COVID. 20% of their employees don't even live in the county anymore, or can't come to the office, okay? They have 70 to 80 people coming in each day. Okay, this is a company that if they could reset their lease today, which expires I think in another 3 years or so, they'd probably take 15 or 20,000 square feet, not 100. And this is really the challenge we have, is that we're in a place today where only half of all the office leases around the country have expired. So when we look at the battle damage, okay, we look at where we are when I get there on a few slides, realize that this is a story still being told. There's a long way to go. And I was just talking to Steve Avoyer about this. He was asking about sort of when this ends. And I said, well, we got another 4 years to go till we get to the bottom in the office sector. And he was a little startled by that. But it's all because of the lease expiration cycles that we live with. You know, the difference here is that unlike, say, year 2000 during the tech wreck, we got millions of square feet of office space given back because the financial markets collapsed, like overnight. Okay, there was a collapse in the capital markets. All these internet and technology companies bled out within a year, handed the keys back, and it was over. Well, corporate America is doing just fine out there. Okay, they're paying their rent. They're not defaulting on leases. Okay, but what are they doing? And let me jump into the first slide here. That's not interesting. So this is looking back about 20 years. How much sublease space is on the market in the United States at any moment in time. And you'll see there's this interesting equilibrium historically where there's about 100 million square feet of office space on the market for sublease at any moment in time. And why would that be? Well, M&A activity, growth, downsizing, right? There's all kinds of dynamics why companies would sublease even in the best of economies, okay? And then you see 2009, 2010, there's this bump, you know, kind of post-financial crisis as companies are trying to rationalize footprint, maybe a bunch of M&A activity, and then back to normal, right? 100 million square feet. And then what happens in 2020? We get this spike. And this is what scared me, right? When I started looking at the data and teasing it out, 2020 started going up unnaturally. And then what happened in 21? It kept going. And you look at where we were last year at 250 million square feet of office for sublease, this is 2.5 times equilibrium, right? Never happened before. And we're still there, right? It's coming down a little bit. Why? Because guess what? Those subleases are now expiring and the landlord's getting the space back. That's what's happening, okay? But along the way, there's been a lot of space out there for available, we call it shadow space, okay? They can't be subleased or won't be subleased. And I'll use my tech again as a great example. So this is a 30,000 square foot tenant downtown. 3 years ago, I went to him and said, hey, Max, CEO, nobody's coming in. Why don't we put the space on the market for sublease? And he's like, well, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. You know, it's still so much uncertainty, and maybe people will come back, and we really would like people to come back, and we want it to be available. Okay, so we revisit a year later. Hey, you know, the people aren't coming back. Maybe we should put this on the market for sublease. Well, you know what? It's already baked into our financial model, and if we put it for sublease, we have to take a write-off, and I don't want to do that. And, you know, we're just going to kind of ride it to the end and see what happens. And plus, they had 2 floors of space where they weren't divisible. They couldn't put fire corridors in, really no way to break up the floors. And as I walk around the world every day, this is what I see. What I see are millions of vacant square feet, empty offices and workstations everywhere, but they can't be subleased because there's no multi-tenant corridors, or the tenant's using half of it and doesn't want to rationalize signing a new lease and moving costs and all these other things. You know, they can't share space. Like, companies don't like to share space, right? Or they're 6 floors in a building and they don't want to restack and reorganize to get rid of 4 of them. But it's coming, okay? All that vacant space, when those leases expire, is coming back, okay? And along the way, corporate America is basically saying, we don't want this stuff. We got too much of it. It's kind of like, I tried to come up with some analogies. It'd be like the car market, and if consumers overnight just stopped driving, you know, what would be the value of a car? Well, a lot less than it is today, okay? But we've got this kind of sticky asset class, right, with lenders and partners and reporting where nobody wants to break ranks on pricing, and the sublease market, at least in the office sector, is driving the market down, okay? And a lot of deals are happening in subleases today. We have clients that only want to look at subleases. And San Diego's doing better than most, by the way. You know, you look at markets like Dallas and Denver and Seattle and San Francisco, you know, they got 9, 10, 11 million square feet stacked up. We've got like 3 million. So we're actually, San Diego's doing better than the rest of the country. So let's look now at some data pre-COVID to now. This is availability, not vacancy. I am personally not interested in vacancy because it understates the market of available space. In other words, if you were going to hire a broker to go buy a house in Scripps Ranch, you wouldn't say, hey, show me the vacant homes for sale. you would say, show me all the homes for sale that meet my criteria, many of which are occupied, right? Okay, well, same in commercial real estate. Buildings under construction, buildings for sublease, space for lease that hasn't expired yet. And I did some calculations. The difference between vacancy and availability, depending on the market you're talking about, is a 40 to 70% spread. In other words, vacancy might be 10%, but availability is 16% or 18%. Or the vacancy might be 16%, and the availability is 23%. Okay, so there's a lot more space on the market, friends, than is being reported. Okay, and these are the availability numbers. So blue is pre-COVID, red is today. And it's startling, right? We hear all this good news about Texas, right? Well, Texas has 3 of the softest markets in the country. Dallas, Houston, Austin, all are 25% or higher availability. San Francisco is a train wreck, as we all know, 34% availability. San Diego, doing better than a lot, sub 20, which is great by, I think, any measure today. Miami is actually doing the best. I don't think I have it on the chart, but they're like around 15% availability. So what's scary about these numbers are, they've doubled in most cases, but again, to my point earlier, they got a long way to go. Okay, as the remainder of leases expire here and around the country, generally companies are getting smaller that occupy office space. There'll be a few expansions and you'll see big news about them, right? People will shout from the rooftops, so-and-so took twice as much space, right? Again, it's about the outlier. And I think in this, we have to look at the world not how we want it, because I don't want this either, okay, but how it is. And I'll tell you why I don't want this, okay? I think I'm misunderstood. Yes, I'm a tenant representative, but I have to operate in the same world all of you do every day, okay? But when rents go to shit, like they have, guess what happens? Landlords lose their buildings. And when landlords lose their buildings, the tax basis comes down. And when the tax basis comes down, the municipalities have less money to spend on services, right? So our community is negatively affected when all this happens. There's a result that is undesirable. When my clients like Abacus Next go from 65,000 square feet down to 6,000 square feet, it affects what I make, okay? When clients of mine like Platform Services are talking about dumping half their space, and we've got it on the market at $1.95 for sublease and haven't had a tour in a year, when that client moves or renews, it's going to affect my income, right? So for me, this is bad news, right? Companies getting smaller, paying less rent has a negative effect on me too. Now I have to operate with integrity, right? I got to do what I do every day and serve these tenants and do my job, okay? But I don't wish this on anyone. And I want people to understand that this is not good news for us either, okay, just because we represent tenants. Yes, tenants are going to get extraordinary values. It's going to be a great market for tenants for 5 years, maybe 10 years. But at the end of the day, that isn't great for our economy. It doesn't really serve me well either, okay? So I just wanted to put that out there so I'm not misunderstood. But here's what's scary about these numbers. I forecast that 4 years from now, all of these red lines will have another 5 percentage points added on top of them. That when you look at these Texas markets, they'll be over 30. You look at San Francisco, it might be 45. Okay, these numbers are only going up, and they're going to keep going until they find some kind of equilibrium where all the leases have expired and all the office tenants have reset their footprints, and the employees are going to continue to behave like they have generally. Again, there'll be some employers that are more successful than others getting people back to the office, but the idea that people are in mass going to come back 5 days a week, I think it's a fantasy, okay? And I think it's a disaster for our economy, by the way. I think what's going to happen to us when the history books are written 10 years from now will be less innovative, less competitive, less connected, have more mental health problems, have less culture, less communication, less innovation. I think this story ends badly. I don't think any of this is good, but it is what's happening. Let me talk about industrial a little bit now. So, we were flying high with the consumer moving to online purchasing, right? And buying goods and services online. They couldn't build warehouse buildings quick enough in 2021. And so rents essentially in Southern California doubled, as y'all know. The Inland Empire went from 85 cents a foot to $1.85 in like 2 years, okay? Didn't happen across the country, mostly in the supply chain markets. I mean, you go to Tennessee and this didn't happen. Okay, Nashville, it's not the same phenomenon. Southern California was really our experience where all these goods coming in from the ports, remember the ships backlogged in 2020 and 2021, hundreds of ships just sitting out there waiting to be unloaded. Well, all that's now reversed, okay? And the industrial companies are now rationalizing all this bloat that they took on to support the consumer because the consumer has found a new normal. And certainly Peloton and other companies that were selling to the consumer have realized that now. So you look at where we are today, we have over 200 million square feet around the country for sublease in the industrial sector. Okay, again, similar graph and timeline as the office sector looking at aggregate supply of sublease space, doubled in the last year. Never happened before. Okay, it's more than ever, and it's doubled in a year. There is no historic precedence for what's happened today. And if we look then around the country, this is now, again, the blue lines and the red lines. This is not pre-COVID to today. This is Q1 22, when things were really at their peak to today. And again, this is availability versus then and now. So San Diego, almost up to 10% availability. Inland Empire has become a bloodbath at 13% availability. You look again at some of these Texas markets, right, that everybody wants to brag about. They're in Texas first. Well, look, Texas is first in availability rates in Austin, followed by Dallas-Fort Worth, pretty close behind. And Phoenix has become a total bloat. So I got some numbers for you. So I ran a survey this morning of industrial spaces on the market between 100 and 200,000 square feet in various metro areas. And I ran this data around the same time. I had a client in the LA region wanted a warehouse. And there in LA County, there were 9 buildings in 2021 available between 100 and 200,000 square feet, 9. Well, guess how many there are today? There's 93. And in the Inland Empire, we were in bidding wars for buildings of this size back in 2021. Bidding wars, okay? I did a transaction with Glambia in Corona for 300,000 square feet, and while we were in leases, the landlord came back and added a nickel to the rent because they'd received 3 more proposals from strong credit tenants while we're in leases, and the landlord came back and says, hey, I got some bad news, I gotta raise the rent a nickel. It's never happened to me before, okay? And our client agreed to it because they had no other choices, okay? But in the Inland Empire today, between 100 and 200,000 square feet, there's 119 options. And Phoenix has 145, Dallas has 248, and Atlanta has 139. This is a problem, and these markets are in trouble. And what they built for was this sort of curve that everybody saw in 2021 and 2022 that they thought would last forever. I mean, people literally, this is the problem with real estate developers, and I was one briefly, or associated with one at Trammell Crow Company, is they always build for the future based on the past. And the development timeline is so lengthy, right? For industrial, you got a couple of years, for office, 4 or 5 years. You kind of miss the market. You're either first in or you're kind of under the train to a degree. And so here's what happened. In 2022, industrial delivered 771 million square feet of new buildings to the market. Now, only half of those are leased. And now in 2024, there's another 600 million square feet under construction, right now. Okay, for whom? So industrial nationally has a big problem, and there's going to be others that are going to talk about what's happening locally. Things are not great here either. Sublease space is at historic highs and availability is clipping up. But here's what's crazy. These red lines are back to pre-COVID, right? If I took pre-COVID to today, the red lines would be the same for the most part, okay? But yet rents haven't changed, okay? And I argue, what asset class has this kind of volatility, right? But the pricing is essentially the same. Well, the answer is the pricing's not staying the same very much longer. Prices are changing, will change. Right now up in the LA area, we're already doing industrial deals, in the $1.50 range, no longer $2. So this market is very fluid right now and shifting, and those industrial landlords who sort of wake up to this new reality and get competitive and get ahead of this are going to win, because a year, 2, 3 from now, it's going to be a lot worse. So I want to talk briefly about lab, and there's others that are going to talk about this in detail because there is a lot of good news in San Diego regarding the life science industry. But here's the bad news. So all of you recognize this map. Just out of curiosity last week, I thought I would see how much space was available for lease now in Torrey Pines, UTC, Serena Mesa, Serena Valley, of existing lab space. Okay, now for those of you who do lab space or know anything about it, back in 2020, there was an immediate feeding frenzy and there weren't any buildings left. And that led into 2021 and 2022 with essentially having significantly more demand than supply. Well, the world has changed, ladies and gentlemen. So there's been some overdevelopment, unfortunately, not as severe as Boston and Northern California, but there's still been overdevelopment, in my opinion. There's a bunch of sublease space on the market that's flooded things. There's like 50 of them now. And there's a bunch of second generation space that's come back to market. So this map now represents 5.2 million square feet of wet lab space on the market for lease or sublease today of 123 buildings. There's never been more on the market. Okay, so while the sector is still exciting, there's a serious supply problem. Okay, and this doesn't even include all those that hope to convert, right? Or the proposed buildings that want to be biotech. Also doesn't include all the space coming back to market. You know, there's a bunch coming back in Torrey Pines as tenants kind of move around. Pfizer allegedly going to sell their campus, so there's more inventory. And the bad news, the sad news, is that we're now starting to see companies running out of cash and defaulting on their leases. I forecast it between now and the end of next year through companies either going through an M&A transaction, mostly through bankruptcy or an assignment for benefit of creditors, or simply hitting the wall and running out of cash. You're going to see about 1 million square feet come back between now and the end of next year through defaults of tenants. So in the short term, and it depends what you think short term is, I think it's more like 3 years, things are going to continue to get worse. And there's going to be tremendous downward pressure on rents and tremendous upward pressure on concessions, and we're already seeing it. And so those landlords who've been doing this a lot longer, like the Longfellows and the Alexandrias and the BMRs and the Health Peaks, are going to get really beat up on the way down. But those folks are survivors. They've been here longer than anybody. They're smarter than anybody. They know how to underwrite the credit. They've got bigger portfolios. But the folks that are the newcomers to market, they're going to get crushed. They're just going to get crushed. So, you know, the news for me is there's really no safe harbor today. You know, unlike 2020, 21, 22, where you could kind of succeed in industrial, succeed in life science, it's bumpy everywhere. And I have a new expression. There aren't any bumps in the road. That is the road. Okay, so we got a long way ahead of us to sort of figure out where the bottoms are in these asset classes in our community and nationally, and then try to rebuild from there.
Dave, one question before we move on.
Yeah.
As you look at these, you know, past 3 downturns that you've been through, right? So early 90s, 01, 08, where do you project this plays out?
This will be the worst in most of your memories, and it's because you're younger than I am. But this will only be compared to the early 90s by the time it's over. You know, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of the foreclosures. This will ultimately negatively affect the banking sector as local and regional banks own so much of this paper, and they then have busted balance sheets as a result of this devaluation. So, you know, this is going to have really long and deep negative implications, I think, on the economy. And we're not seeing it yet, and hopefully it's not abrupt, but I don't think it's going to end well. And so it will make, you know, 2000 tech wreck and the 08-09 financial crisis look like a rounding error, frankly. So I think this is going to be long and ugly, sadly.
Thank you. We're gonna talk about, that's obviously the user side of the market. We're gonna end with Rick Reeder, who's gonna talk about, from an ownership perspective, what the cost of capital means if leasing's down and carrying buildings and impact on value and distress and so forth. But we're gonna move now to Tim Olson. I think everybody knows Tim. Tim and I have had the pleasure of working together for, I think we're pushing 20 years or close to. and office expert. That's what he's going to cover. He runs the JLL offices and is the man in charge. So I'll hand it over to you, Tim.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Glad to be here. Wow. Karen, do you know if the bar is open yet? In all seriousness, I mean, it's a lot, right? I think Dave does a great job of articulating it, and it feels more like CNN and Fox for like an hour, but I think it gives great insight, and I think a lot of it's factual, and I'm joking with you, but because everyone expects that, but
What's not factual?
nothing. I just said it's interesting perspective, right? You got to have a different spin. So I subscribe to the PNN, the Positive News Network, but I also think it's good to have the realistic insight that Dave has day to day walking through all these offices. So there's a lot, and most of what he's saying is factual based on the data. So I just want to go through some slides on the office market and just touch on some things that are interesting to me. I think that we're in it for a long haul, but and I think it's going to be a challenging market. But I think, again, you mentioned the gray hair, you mentioned the bald people, they're still here, right? We live in a cyclical world, we live in a cyclical market. It's not going to be forever. So a lot of grim faces out there right now. Like, there is optimism in the world. San Diego is in a good place. So, but there are challenges ahead. So what I'm going to touch on just quickly, supply a little bit of demand, talk a little bit about return to office. Chad talked about what's happening across the world, and is that an indicator of what we're going to see? Is that something that can help get us out of the challenges that Dave talked about? And it's not going to be fast, but I think there's some things that we can look forward to as far as what's to come in San Diego and the rest of the world. So I think a little bit of the indicator, the question of who's in the office 4 or 5 days a week, I was going to do the same thing, and I think that's positive. Yes, we're focused on that industry, and that's impacting our careers, so we are working, but I think there's something to be said about being in the office, having the productivity, and I think we're yet to see in the world as far as the impact of the lack of productivity that's coming from hybrid work. Yes, CEOs are saying that this is my policy now, but we all know things aren't permanent. So looking in supply, I think the phenomenal stat, and Dave touched on it, San Diego's doing a lot better than the rest of the country. So if you look at this chart, this is the top 50 markets, over 50 million square feet. Yes, this is total vacancy, not availability. As Dave mentioned, our availability is closer to 19%. But I think it's also interesting, especially like a market like San Diego, not all available space becomes vacant. In our market, which I'll touch on later, a lot of that supply ends up, becoming conversion, gets demolished in this cycle, or never comes vacant. For example, MedImpact and Scripps Ranch, they put 150,000 square feet on the market for sublease. They acquired a company and they moved back into it. So there are dynamics where availability doesn't always come vacant, but there's a lot of it, so there's a lot of work to do. So for San Diego, why are we the lowest vacancy? And if you look in COVID, when we came into COVID, San Diego had a lot of great momentum carrying into COVID. And I think what changed our market is the expansion of big tech in San Diego. Before COVID, we had none of the big tech companies in a big way in our market. Now, pretty much all of the major technology companies that we use their devices and software are here in San Diego. So I think that has forever changed our market. It may not be as impactful right now, but that's helped to soften the blow from a lot of the new supply, a lot of the downsizing that's come into our market. So we have a nice buffer, in my opinion. And I think those dynamics of tech, and then Brian will touch on life science. Life science removed a lot of inventory out of the office market, which again is creating this buffer and maybe helps to soften the landing a bit as companies, as Dave mentioned, continue to give back space over the next few years. I'll move on to the next slide. This is just looking at San Diego. This is an interesting graph looking at the difference between our suburban market and downtown market. So downtown, 22% total vacancy, heading to 35%, as many know. But our suburban market is still at 11.6. So the why, I think that's also another driver as to why San Diego has performed well through COVID compared to the rest of the country, because we are predominantly a suburban market. And we all heard through COVID, it's easier to get people back to work when you're not having to commute as far, you're not having to go up elevators, all these different dynamics. So downtown is a whole nother story, which I won't go into in detail. I think it's a much more challenged market, and it's going to have it's been challenged for a long time, but it's going to have a much farther place to climb out of than the suburban markets where we've had the expansion of tech, we've had the expansion of life sciences, and we have such a great defense and aerospace cluster in a lot of our suburban markets. And this is interesting. I touched on conversion. So we talk about all this new supply that's going to come on, or availability that's going to come on as companies downside. Well, another positive, really a phenomenal stat I think for San Diego is just looking at how much of our office stock is coming out of the inventory. So this graph, if you look at it, the blue is our total office stock in the county. So kind of peak in 2021, 88.7 million square feet. And if you look back from 2015 out to 2025, there'll be a total of 8.4 million square feet of office space that gets converted or redeveloped. So again, helping to soften the blow of new availability. And I think this trend will continue as we see, again, obsolete office or other product that becomes multi-housing or gets converted to life science. So I think that's a dynamic that is a positive and will be a trend that we continue to see going forward. So moving on to demand, as Dave mentioned, a lot of downsizing, a lot of right sizing, and that's really where we're struggling in San Diego right now if you look at just the need for additional office space. And I'll point you to the top bar, if you can see it, the red line across the middle. We're running at about 50% of our historical tenant demand, and that's a problem. So, what's driving that is obviously uncertainty in the market. It's the lack of ability to make decisions around return to office and people coming back to work. We'll see that, over time, people will come back and I think things will change, but right now we're challenged by the lack of large tenant demand in the market. If you look at the chart on the left, we have, we have 0 tenants in the market over 100,000 square feet. But then Chad mentioned the other day that we also have a new requirement in the market that's looking for about 400,000 square feet. So again, we never know when the tide's going to turn and when things are going to come back. So I think we need to remain optimistic. And this chart's looking at gross leasing activity. So if you look at the market, yes, our demand is way off, but I think if we look at gross leasing activity across the board, we've started to rebound to pre-COVID levels. If you look pre-COVID, we had about 6.8 million square feet of gross leasing, and we're slowly, creeping back up. So last year, we had about 6.7 million square feet of gross leasing in our market. And if you break down the different colors, the tan color is relocations, so that stayed pretty steady since 2017. The light blue is new and expansion, so that's where we're struggling, right? The new and the growth that Dave mentioned, mostly downsizing. That's cut in about half, and then the dark blue is renewals. So that's the big shift. If you look pre-COVID, renewals accounted for about 30% of total transactions, and in 2023, it accounted for about 58% of transactions. So what that is telling me, yes, there are companies that are hanging on, but I think that it shows that companies aren't just handing the keys back for their office space. They're continuing to operate, continue to see if things are going to change, our company's going to come back, or they're not going to, as Dave mentioned, some are just saying, hey, I can't move out of it, I can't write it off, I can't demise it. But again, I think it's a positive trend line that companies aren't just moving out of office space, that in over almost 60% are continuing to sustain and renewing their transactions. And I think this is a positive sign, just seeing the gross leasing activity in the market is remaining. And this, again, looking at San Diego as a whole, I think we have a lot going for us. I think the life science sector, which Brian touched on, it boomed through COVID, and that's going to continue to impact our market. The technology sector, as I mentioned, big tech has moved into San Diego in a big way, and I think we've yet to see the impact of what that's going to do to our market. People relocated to San Diego. San Diego had actually positive population growth for all the reasons that we all live here. Great schools, great weather, a lot of outdoor activities. So I think San Diego will continue to harness that big tech momentum in town, and I think, again, helps to soften the blow over time because no one really knows when demand's going to turn back on. And then just the basis of our aerospace and defense, $36 billion impact in our local economy, and that's consistent year over year. So it's a great stable, sector to have in town, and I think will be a driver for future demand as well. And the last one I think is really interesting, and UCSD drives a large part of this as well as SDSU. But we have over 13,000 STEM graduates in San Diego every year. That's huge. Historically, a lot of those people would leave. They go to San Francisco, they go to LA, they go to Boston, they go to other markets. But I think San Diego is growing up, and I think we're able to retain a lot more of that talent, which long term, if you look at employment growth, if you look at innovation, having those STEM workers in our town and staying in our town is critical. And I think through COVID, our base and our foundation has changed to where we can attract and retain a lot more of that talent. So the last thing I'll touch on is RTO, or return to office outlook. And Chad mentioned, like, what is the rest of the world doing? And so I pulled a global chart from JLL to look at what the reentry rates are across the globe. You know, we all joke, I mean, I've joked in my life, well, if you live in Europe, you don't work. Well, based on this chart, people in Europe are working more than we are. So is that a problem, and is that going to sustain? Because I think return to office is one of the critical things that's going to lead to more office demand. So you look through this chart, the red is Asia Pacific, the light gray is Europe, and we're in the blue. So we're last. Thankfully, this room is not last based on the head count. But if you look at Asia, on average, you're looking at, call it 90 to 95% return to office. If you're looking at Europe, it's closer to 70 to 75%. And the US is 50 to 55. In my opinion, that doesn't sustain. They were first into the pandemic and first out. You know, we were last in. Are we going to be last out? How long will it take? Will we get there? You know, are there cultural differences between Asia and Europe and us? You know, we can go remote work in our nice backyard and have all this space. Obviously, in Europe and Asia, living environments are different, and condos, and so is the office an outlet for them? Or is this an indicator to what's to come for the US? I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, and the big question is how long? So I think it's just an interesting chart and something that we'll continue to watch and track, because the world is a follower. There is a lot of follower mentality to our globe and our economy. In San Diego specifically, we've tracked that data as it relates to return to office, and I think this room is a little bit of a sentiment of it. But we take a company called Placer AI, so they track cell phone signals. So since 2019, we've been tracking, I think it was 35 different buildings, 15 projects. It's in every major submarket. We took a few Class A, a few Class B buildings and carried on that data set. And you can see it's consistent. We're coming back to work. You know, we went from 57% in 2022, 61% in 23, and then year to date, we're at about 69%. So again, positive trend line. I think that also, again, for San Diego, we're at a little bit different than the rest of the world and in our market because we're heavy in the suburban cluster as far as a lot of our employment base. But again, a positive, I think, to continue to see that, and I think that's what ultimately helps to lead to additional demand. And then this is another one, again, productivity, sentiment of CEOs, like who are going to make those decisions to get people back to the office. And I think Dave mentioned a lot of his clients have all these different policies, you know, don't work, you know, come into the office when you want. You know, sounds great, but I think over time our productivity lags. I think we look forward, you know, in the future. I think Gensler and some other architecture firms are going to come out with reports so that we can redo all our offices again that says, you know, your productivity is way off. You can't be in the office 2 or 3 days a week. You need to be in the office. And I think for a lot of the young people in this room, it's good to see everyone comes in the office, because I think, you know, throughout our country, culturally, we're going to have a knowledge gap because there is so much you learn and glean from being in the office and having that side-to-side collaboration. And if you look at the study from KPMG, they surveyed CEOs in 2023, 64% of CEOs think that we'll come back to pre-pandemic attendance by 2026. But again, this isn't going to turn on overnight. It's going to have to work through a lot of the dynamic that Dave mentioned. A lot of supply, you know, and a lot of other challenges with obsolete assets in the market. But I think this is positive to see if you think of sentiment from a macro perspective. And then just looking at, you know, again, the chart of the different companies. I think the interesting ones, you know, you always hear like back office, insurance, healthcare, all these companies are just going to be remote forever. I point out Geico. You know, they started at 2 days a week and now they're 4 days a week. And I think what's happening with a lot of corporations, they're sensitive to mandating that employees come back, but it's also if they start out small, they get a foot in the door, and it seems in many instances these companies, they'll have a mandate at one point, and then shortly thereafter they'll increase it. So as I mentioned, Geico in that instance, you look at Verizon, they started out 1 day a week, now they're 4 day a week. So there is a trend line to see that people are pushing their employees back, and until we, I guess from a more macro perspective, see that imbalance between employee employer come back, it's going to be a slow return, but I think these are definitely positive metrics. And surprising for me, some of the industries that have more of a 3 to 4 day return to work mandate. So that's really it. I think I will summarize it by saying, we have a long way to go. But I think for San Diego, the positive thing is that we have minimal new construction. You talk about Dallas. Dallas had a ton of new construction compared to San Diego. Really, we have some product delivering in 2024, but going forward, there's really no new office supply that's coming into the market. So you couple that with the reduction of supply, that's going to help temper all of the new vacancy and downsizing that we're going to experience. It's inevitable, but it's going to help soften the blow. And as I mentioned, the removal of supply from our market from redevelopment or conversion is going to happen. Rental rates, as Dave mentioned, we're going to continue to see a slow decline. I think, a few years ago, we were thinking there was going to be a much more abrupt drop of rental rates across the market. San Diego has fared very well compared to the rest of the country. But with the increases of demand, increases of supply, and just being off pace with our demand, we're going to see a slow decline of rental rates. How far does that go? TBD, what happens with foreclosures and things like that, and how does that drive rents down? It's yet to be determined, and I think it will be really micro market by micro market specific. And then the last thing takeaway is really around return to office, and again, that's going to drive new demand in the market. But I think we're going to continue to see productivity declines as a culture, as a country, and I think over time we're going to see that leverage shift between the employer and the employee, and I think we're going to push to more of a 4 to 5 day per week for the majority of industry by 2026. And that's going to be the catalyst in large part to our demand returning and helping to kind of get out of this, what's going to be a long, prolonged recovery. But those are the indicators and the things that need to happen. But I think overall, San Diego is in a much more positive place compared to the rest of the country, and I'm optimistic that that we'll have a great future ahead of us. But there's going to definitely be some hard times ahead.
Thanks, Tim. I think Tim got a JLL pass on the time. He dominated a lot of the time there, but it was good. It was well said.
That was more than 15 minutes?
Just like, it's okay. Couple quick thoughts on just what Tim said. We are still in a global stage, right? And it's a global competitive environment. So I wonder if executives are going to drive people back to work in order to be competitive on a global stage, right? Will that drive it? Not so much the employee or the government or what have you. Is that really what the driver is? And you touched on it, but I mean, the real wild card for San Diego is big tech. Big tech is not being rewarded right now for growth. They're being rewarded by stock increases by cutting cost, right, and improving profit. But if that turns, San Diego was on a run, right? We never thought that was going to happen. It was happening, and now we're kind of off the boat thinking it's never going to happen again. And we're faring better than any other market in the country as it relates to big tech sublease. And so, there are dynamics in the office that are interesting. So let's move over to life science. Brian Stark, life science extraordinaire, probably has done more high quality projects and I'd say overall life science leasing than anybody, as much as it pains me to say that, over the last 5 to 10 years, and great guy and very knowledgeable. So I'll kick it off over to you.
Awesome. Good morning. I don't know about you guys, I was a little stressed out from David Williams' speech. Anyone have a Xanax on them I can borrow? Brian Stark with Cushman & Wakefield. So today I'm just going to give a high-level overview of the life science market as a whole, so nationally, and then we'll dive into the San Diego market. I'll discuss some of the significant driving forces that define our local ecosystem, talk about C-suite talent, venture capital, and then both the supply and demand side of that market. And then at the end, we'll talk about some predictions for 2024 and 2025. So biotechnology has entered what we call a golden age. So it's a convergence of science, big technology, and data that have all merged together to create some of the greatest breakthroughs in drug development in the history of our time. Another big factor that's affecting the market is that we have an increased aging population. It's estimated that our population's age is going to double by 2050. And so what does that mean? It means we need to provide better diagnostics, better healthcare, more therapies. We're also, in 2023, the FDA approved more drugs than any time in the history. So they approved 73 new medicines. So as you can see, biotech has become a vital sector of our global economy. It contributes to over $5 trillion in economic impact. And who have the big winners been? Well, it's been Big Pharma. Big Pharma is sitting on $1.4 trillion of dry powder right now. And so you've probably seen the headlines. Many big pharma companies are expanding their R&D platforms, and we're also seeing major M&A events across the markets. So the net effect of all this is that precision therapies and diagnostics are really going to improve our longevity and also the quality of our lives. So how does San Diego stack up to the broader market? So San Diego is the third largest life science hub in the US. Our market's about 18.5 million square feet. If you expand north and south, it's about 24 million square feet. But what makes it super unique is that we're the tightest cluster of any of the clusters in the US at only a 5-mile radius. So packed into that 5-mile radius, we have amazing institutes, universities, big pharma. We have a great startup ecosystem, along with all the IP law firms and the different firms that support that life science industry. And if you look at our vacancy, we're doing really well. So it's kind of similar to what Tim talked about and Dave talked about. San Diego's performing far better than many of the other markets. We're at 11% vacancy in San Diego, 16 in San Fran, and over 22 in Boston, and that number's quickly rising. I would say one of the most important metrics to dig in on is the under construction pipeline. We've got 3.1 million square feet that's under development today, but already 1.2 million square feet of that's been spoken for. So about 66% of the inventory that's coming online is unleased, but it's very high quality real estate. If you look at San Francisco, if you look at Boston, the numbers are 2, 3, 4x that, especially if you start going out into the suburban market. So they've got some major problems in those markets. So what are the significant driving forces that make San Diego so unique? I touched on some of them. We have over 100 research institutes. The Salk Institute, Sanford Burnham and Scripps Institute, they routinely are in the top 10 institutes in the world. And UC San Diego is a global powerhouse. It's actually the #2 biology and biochemistry university in the world. And it turns out more STEM graduates, more PhD students than MIT and Harvard combined. So we really have this amazing ecosystem just down the road here that is really, there's tons of knowledge being created there. And something that we often overlook is the presence of big pharma. San Diego has a footprint of about 2.7 million square feet of big pharmaceutical companies, and they are growing and expanding today. As I mentioned, they have all this excess capital. And when you talk with Bristol Myers Squibb, Lilly, Novartis, Takeda, Vertex, many of them say that San Diego is their center of excellence for research and development. And so I think that's a testament to the scientific talent that exists here in San Diego. So those three factors really create this incredible ecosystem. Another really important thing to speak about is just the C-suite and scientific talent. This is just a sampling of some of the folks here in San Diego, but many of these folks are Nobel laureates, and you have C-suite and executive talent that is producing and continually creating new companies. And so we've created basically a flywheel for company formation. Many of these folks have had multi-billion-dollar exits and then gone and started new companies over and over again. And so it's very unique to our market and something that everyone should understand. So the main driving force, are you guys getting kind of an echo there? The main driving force for life science companies is venture capital. Pre-pandemic, our average venture capital raise was about, or total raise was about 1.2 billion over 5 years pre-pandemic. And then obviously in 2021, we saw about 6.3 billion in venture capital raised. So this was obviously record-setting venture capital. And then as the market cooled in 2022 and 2023, those numbers came down to 2.8 and 2.6 billion respectively. But those are still over 2x what we saw during pre-pandemic levels. So capital is still flowing into the market. In 2024, we've had a banner year. We've already seen 1.7 billion in venture capital raised year to date, and many experts believe that those numbers will go to 4 or 5 billion this year. So capital is flowing in. I think something that we kind of missed in 2023 is we saw 2.6 billion in venture capital raised, but generally we see a correlation between companies raising capital and going out and identifying new real estate, and that really didn't happen. So I feel like there's quite a bit of pent-up demand, and that activity is going to pick up towards the second half of this year. On the right is just a sampling of some of the companies that have raised capital. Mirador is a great story. It goes back to that kind of C-suite, that flywheel of executive and scientific talent. Mark McKenna, who started Mirador, previously founded a company called Prometheus. He sold Prometheus to Merck for $10.8 billion, decided, hey, let's get the band back together, went out and raised a $400 million Series A, and now his company's out in the market looking for a significant footprint. So that's how the flywheel happens, and that's how capital is recirculated in the market, and it's a very important part of our ecosystem. So this is just a snapshot of historical leasing demand. So just to break it down for you, the dark blue is our average tenant demand. So that's what we're tracking year over year, month over month. So what tenants are in the market actively looking for space. The light blue is the actual leases executed. And then the green is our net absorption. So how much space was given back and how much space was leased in any given year. So you'll see from this chart that in 2021, it was a banner year once again. So it kind of correlates with what we saw with venture capital. So we saw 3.6 million square feet of leases executed, 1.5 million square feet of overall net absorption. And then as the market started to cool in 2023, those numbers dropped significantly. 2023 was our worst leasing year in probably 7 years. It's the first year that we saw net negative absorption. And now you can see the numbers are ticking back up. We've already had 786,000 square feet of leases executed, and we're reporting positive absorption today. So hopefully we've kind of bottomed out, so to speak, and we're rebounding here. So once again, as a life science expert in the space, we're tracking tenant demand. This is just a snapshot of the demand we're tracking today. We're tracking 1.5 million square feet, which is still well above what we saw in pre-pandemic levels. Obviously, the market got supercharged during the pandemic. Tons of capital poured into the space. You had crossover investors coming in, and now that's cooled down, and so you have kind of more rational investment happening. What's really interesting about the demand today, tracking 20 requirements, over 60% of the demand is over 100,000 square feet, and it's very strong credit profile companies. If you look in Boston or you look in San Francisco, there's no big pharma, there's no big credit demand to speak of. I mean, there's some stuff that's very far out. And this is really the inverse of what we typically see in our market, because we're really like a grow to sell market. Generally, we have lots of startup and mid-cap companies. They get to a certain critical mass or a certain sort of IP, and then they're acquired by big pharma. And so we're really missing that whole piece of the supply today. And once again, my prediction is that that's going to come back, because that's generally been the lifeblood of our ecosystem. And it's kind of unique to see that we just have a lot of big pharma activity. But I also think, once again, that's a testament to the scientific talent here in San Diego. You look like Bristol Myers Squibb, they just announced a bunch of layoffs. They're shutting down 2 facilities in San Francisco, but in San Diego, they're growing. We're hearing that story over and over again from other large pharmaceutical companies. So once again, a testament to our market. And these are just some of the industries that are the main drivers, which are oncology, immunology, drug discovery, and obviously big pharma. So touching on the sublease space conundrum, I mean, it's definitely happening. We're seeing an increase, quarter over quarter. We're tracking over 1 million square feet of sublease space. Tricky thing with sublease space as it relates to life science companies is that a large portion of it is very unleasable. Dave brought up so eloquently, the credit profile of these companies, they're failing. So who's going to come in and backfill a lease with a company that may not have their lights on or be able to pay the rent? So we see about 60% of that is either structural vacancy, meaning it's just unleasable because it's dated, it's been purpose built, so it's just not able to be utilized for another company. And then more so, with most subleases, you have to have landlord intervention in order to actually move the space. So although the sublease space is coming online, we're not really seeing it as a competitive type of product for new companies in the market. So then moving to the development and redevelopment pipeline. So as I mentioned, we have about 3.1 million square feet in San Diego that's under construction in the central markets. 1.2 million square feet of that has already been pre-leased, so we have about 1.8 million square feet that's coming available in the next 2 years. I agree with everyone on the panel that I think there's definitely going to be a flight to quality. I think companies in today's age, it's a fierce battle for talent. And so companies are going to go to the Class A assets with great, amazing amenities, purpose-built facilities, great shipping, live loading, floor-to-floor heights. And so you're going to see some of this B and C asset real estate really languish in the market. And my predictions. So obviously we've already seen the downturn in 2022 and 2023. And that tracks very closely with the XBI or the SPIDER index. And so that's a basket of biotech companies traded on the public market. The SPIDER index actually peaked in February of 21. It bottomed in July of 2022, and we're now seeing that rebound. And so I think that's just testament that Wall Street is actually getting back on board. I think a lot of these companies' valuations have been marked to market, and so there's actually interest in investing because the values have gotten to a point where it makes sense. As a result of the increased venture capital that we're seeing flowing into the space, I think transaction activity will pick up in the second half of the year into the first half of 2025. Another thing that a lot of folks are talking about is the industry patent cliff. So big pharmaceutical companies, when they get patents on these blockbuster drugs, they go off patent in about 10 years, and that creates opportunities for a number of mid-cap companies to come in and develop generics and biosimilars. So I think there's going to be significant growth in that space over the next 6 years. And then big pharma. Big pharma is going to continue to grow. You guys have probably all heard of Wegovy, some of these weight loss drugs. Well, those are called glucose-like peptide 1 inhibitors, GLP-1s. That market today is a $10 billion market today. It's going to be a $30 billion market in 5 years and a $100 billion market in about 15 years. The reason for that is that there's a number of follow-on indications that are driving that space for type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiac issues as well. And so that's a massive market. You'll see every major pharmaceutical player is going to be getting into that space over the next 15 years. So the big question is, when's market stabilization? Chad and I have been debating this. I mean, we think it's probably, we're going to hit market equilibrium in Q4 of 2026. Obviously, I think there's going to be some companies that are going to fail, and that's actually part of the life science industry. They're not all winners. It's a long-term business. It takes 10, 15 years to get a drug FDA approved. And so these venture capital companies are making, these are calculated risk bets, and a lot of them fail. But very well could be the early innings of a bull run. That's it.
Great. Rick, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great, thanks, Chad. Dave talked a little bit about his background when he got in the business, and I actually predate Dave, so I think I'm the oldest person in the room and have an anecdotal story to go along with it. Is when I started the business, I can remember in the early 80s making calls, and I had one call early in my career, and it just stuck with me forever, and called on an investor, and he stopped me in the middle of the call and he said, Rick, why are you wasting your time? Have you looked at the Wall Street Journal lately? Interest rates are 22% right now. And I've never forgotten that, and I think today we need to think about that perspective. We have become addicted to low costs of capital, and retrospectively, we can move a long ways upwards and still be in a very healthy state. And everybody right now is very concerned about the fact that we have interest rates in real estate transactions in the 7s to 10s, depending upon the type of debt that you are looking at. But realistically, in the long run, it's not necessarily that high of an interest rate, albeit we'll end up somewhere much better than that. But we all need to wean ourselves from an unbelievably low cost of capital over the last 3 to 5 years. So let's talk about what's going on in the market and what's causing it. I'll try to make this quick. I know it's been a long day. And it is mostly to do with interest rates, but it's not all interest rates. It's capital flows and what's going on with institutional America and what they're choosing to invest in and not invest in. And this slide is a good way of kicking it off, just to show where we've come in the last few years from an overall cost of debt capital, and how that's impacting trading volumes and activity in the marketplace. So most of our participants in the market right now are looking at, if you're in the refinance market, are looking at refinancing costs that are 2 to 3 times what you had been expecting. And that's having a severe impact on what's trading and what's not trading. So to really understand that, let's look not only to the interest rates, but other factors that are affecting us in trading office buildings and other asset classes in the local market. And when you look at this, we've taken a couple of hypothetical transactions where you look at an office building versus other asset classes. Other asset classes are not feeling every asset class is feeling the pain of today's interest rate market. But the office market is feeling additional pain because the capital flows have moved away. Institutional America has essentially moved out of office and is trying to divest itself of office right now and its office exposure. So what does that mean to someone who's looking to trade a building, refinance a building in today's world? And so with this hypothetical example, it just shows you that not only the interest rate is degrading the value, but also the metrics involved in the valuation. And those two things combined are pushing more of our lower quality commodity oriented office into a position of having an overall value somewhere below the debt. And that's the problem. You've heard a lot of fantastic information today about how healthy San Diego's market is. And in reality, that's where most of the owners in today's market see their values and their respective interest in trading. They see a good, healthy market and don't understand why the capital markets have moved so sharply in the other direction. If you look at the other example, you can see other asset classes, and again, this is just a broad-based example. Other asset classes are certainly feeling the pain. Values down by 20%. But overall, they're still theoretically in the money, so to speak, with their equity, and at least have the opportunity to trade the asset and come out of the transaction with some money to bear. So let's look at the magnitude of the issue that we're facing right now. As you can see, we've got a massive amount of debt maturing in 2024. A lot of that has to do with what happened in 2023. I think the perspective in mid to late 2023 was that interest rates were going to come down in 2024, and a lot of the institutions, lending world, did an extend and pretend and pushed a lot of their maturities into 2024. If you look at the breakdown of the various colors represented here, you can see 441 billion in office maturities coming forward. And so there's a massive amount of office maturities nationally that are coming due. So let's take a look at, with all these maturities, is there dry powder available? How do we solve for the impending maturities? And overall, our dry powder is relatively good. We have actually a good amount of dry powder, not only because there's a fair amount of capital still on the sidelines, but because a lot of transactions didn't happen last year when there was a lot more uncertainty as to where interest rates were heading. So let's look then how institutions have allocated capital And you can see that residential, industrial, and alternatives being data centers, life science, and you can see office. Clearly, there's an overabundance of capital for the top 3 asset classes. It's even more impactful when you think of office as being one of the larger asset classes out there, and yet only 4% of the capital is allocated to be directed towards that asset class. So if office isn't trading, what is? And last year we saw life science trade. We had a very healthy year of trades. However, it's capital is very sensitive and very selective. And it's driven by location and it's driven by quality. So core markets and core projects, and it's amazing how a mile, a half a mile, or a block might impact the saleability of a particular project. So while there is capital there, it's very selective and very sensitive to many factors. So what's the solution to deal with all this commodity office? I hear over and over again, why don't we just convert this all to residential? We have very favorable state initiatives that allow for creative rezoning. We have a very progressive city that allows for residential. Why don't we just convert? Well, there are an amazing number of reasons why that does not work in today's world. Now, it does work in some places, in some markets that have different market dynamics, but here in San Diego, there are very few conversions that work. And it starts from the physical aspects of office buildings and how they've been designed with size of floor plates and depth of bays, and the fact that residential needs light and air in, and many of these projects, if they were to be converted, would have to have their entire facade ripped off and replaced with balconies and operable windows. On top of that, you have additional pressure from the financial side, and that is that the converters of office to residential are looking for a higher yield than a traditional multifamily deal. They see inherently more risk in a deal like that, so they want a higher return on cost, further pushing down values. In addition to that, they want to have rents that are lower than purpose-built multifamily, and that's another pressure pushing down values. So it goes on and on and on, and the reality is that there's very, very few of these that work. So what is the answer, or at least part of the answer to some of this surplus that we're seeing in the marketplace? And that's actually redevelopment. The city of San Diego has been very progressive in upzoning several of their community plans. And fortunately, it also contains a very liberal allocation to allow developers to go essentially all residential at a high density level, which then in turn allows for an exit of this real estate, which is at reasonable levels. May not be where it was a few years ago, but in many instances it's well above the debt, and it is a very viable exit. You may be concerned that we're going to do like we've done in so many different sectors of overbuilding the space in multifamily, and that may happen, who knows. But right now, we're at such a severe shortage of multifamily deliveries, especially in our mid-cities in North County, that it's hard to envision that happening anytime in the next 3 to 4 years. So a few observations, things happening in the marketplace. We have banks are going to be severely constrained by their commercial real estate holdings and working their way out of that. Operating fundamentals of the more fortunate assets, the trophies, are really making it difficult for some of the lesser buildings, the more commodity office, and really putting pressure on the overall operating numbers of those assets. There are definitely exceptions being made for exceptional projects and exceptional markets. I think a great example of that, if we want to talk about a positive story in office, is Kilroy successfully refinancing their One Paseo project, arguably the best project in San Diego from an office perspective. And that's a perfect example of how it does work in today's world. Capital needs clarity. Right now, you can argue both sides of these issues that were so eloquently laid out today, both by Dave and the other members of the presentation here. But in reality, from an office perspective, capital does not see clarity in the office market. They don't know if Dave's right or if Tim's right. And until that gets resolved, until we work our way through that, and there isn't more examples of how this is all going to settle out, then you're not going to see much capital go into that space, and we're going to be dealing with a difficult marketplace from an office perspective. And then, just as you heard many times today, most investors see San Diego as really the shining star in the West Coast, and actually many in the U.S. So what's this mean going forward? Rate reductions, we can debate this till we're blue in the face, but it's not when we all thought it was going to happen. It's going to be later this year, if this year at all. Expected mid-year pickup in sales volume probably now looks more like fourth quarter or maybe first quarter of next year. The lack of bank funding is going to create opportunities in other capital classes, such as debt funds. San Diego, as you heard many times today, is in a much better place than other markets, and we fare to recover more quickly than other markets. Rates will be higher and longer, higher for longer, unfortunately, but realistically, we need to adopt to a different overall rate market. And then one interesting tidbit that we're seeing is that there is a heavy flow of office building owners looking to reassess their buildings to reduce operating costs to make it through this downturn. And then lastly, we see life science outperform the overall consensus for that asset class. So that's my presentation. Any questions?
Thanks, everybody. I know we're running